Hi, welcome to Cult Hackers. My name is Stephen. I think I must have been around 9 or 10 years old when we had a guy come to our school to talk about race relations. Now, if you're around my age or older, you'll remember the old-fashioned projectors with actual slides placed into a carousel that were used before the era of PowerPoint. Now, this guy using this kit turned up at our school. He was using this to provide some visual aids for his lecture, talking to us about something called multiculturalism. Now, I've not really heard of this term before, but I listened obediently, as I always did. And the idea of people with different colour skin and different cultures who had come together from different countries, or whose parents or grandparents had come from a different country, all living happily together, sounded great to me. As you probably know, I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness. And before I start, I want to say that I know many of my friends who comment on the organisation do raise serious questions about and criticise the organisation for extremely problematic behaviour and practices around race, particularly from the early days of the organisation. If you want to know more about this, I recommend checking out my friend Riley's content on the Jexit channel, and I'll put a link on an episode where he explores this topic. But in my mind, as a child, I was raised to believe that everyone was equal and that the colour of someone's skin was completely irrelevant. I was raised on pictures of people of all sorts wearing their traditional dress, living in paradise, eating and playing together in harmony, where even the wild animals were no longer a threat. I also remember going to what used to be called international conventions, where brothers and sisters from around the world would also attend. We'd be very excited to see the visiting delegates in their traditional dress mingling in the crowd. So as a child listening to our visitor talking about the merits of this thing called multiculturalism, it just sounded great to me. Now, during the slideshow, every now and then there would be a moment when the speaker had neglected to put an actual slide into the projector carousel, which meant that all was projected was a bright white light onto the screen. Oops, he said. Sorry about that. This happened a few times during the show to giggles among the children. Silly grown-up. Anyway, after the presentation, the man asked us to tell him how many times we believed that the blank slide had appeared. And various people gave their answer. Finally, he told us how many times it had happened, and it was much less than anyone had thought. And this was the real lesson. He wasn't so silly after all. Okay, just for context, the school that I went to was predominantly white, as were the social housing estates. We called them council houses, where we came from. But as it happened, the Kingdom Hall we went to was at the heart of the Pakistani and Indian communities in the town where I lived. So I spent a lot of my time talking to Muslims and Hindus about religion in the territory around the hall. In fact, I would later go to lessons to try and learn some basic Punjabi or Urdu, to try to speak to these communities more effectively, with a view to encouraging them out of the religion of their birth to the religion of my birth. Now, there's a point here that, of course, I'll take up later about just how tolerant my religion was of cultural difference, despite my perhaps smug self-concept at the time. But back to school. We notice difference, said the visitor. We notice when things are different to what we expect to see, and we exaggerate its frequency and significance. That's why we notice people who may look different to us or with different cultures more readily, and it's why we tend to overestimate numbers. And that little real-world experiment was really powerful to me. Obviously, I've remembered it after all those years. Of course, it aligned to my existing worldview, but it stayed with me, and I think, to be honest, it's still valid. Really interesting. And I've been pretty alarmed at some of the rhetoric around immigration or migration in my country, in the UK, and what I've been hearing from the US, from France, Germany, lots of other countries. I'm also a bit confused about what I'm hearing from commentators who don't live in the UK, telling me that I live in an Islamic state. The latest example of this is the newly appointed vice presidential candidate, J D Vance, who claims that the UK is the first Islamic country to have nuclear weapons. I don't know, maybe this is hyperbole just for effect, but I've heard more considered arguments from other apparently informed and cogent so-called public intellectuals making similar statements about Britain. That it's being taken over by Islamists, and that the fact that London has a Muslim mayor is somehow proof of this. I'm going to get into the conversation about culture now, but before I do, I just want to say that that is complete and utter nonsense. There also seems to be a train of thought among some commentators that suggest a need to defend the culture against threats from within and without, I suppose. So the topic I'm exploring today is culture. What is it? How does it arise? Does it need defending? Why do we worry about it? And of course, what are the links to cults? I mean, you cannot have failed to notice that the word cult obviously is part of the word culture, so I need to talk about that too. So let's look at the word. Sorry to start the conversation with the definition, but it is kind of important, and it comes from the idea of agriculture. Of course, the word cult or culture is in there too. So this is around cultivating something, growing something. So it starts off with that framework, but then it starts to be associated with human behaviour, apparently in the 18th and 19th centuries. So cultural practices grow and develop. They do this naturally, but I think it's also interesting because of the origin of the word. It does suggest that there's some intervention here, as opposed to just leaving things or leaving nature to its own devices. And I guess in a way this is the tension that's inherent in the very concept itself. How much intervention is appropriate in cultural development? Who gets to intervene and shape the culture? Now there's a second strand that I'm not going to spend too long on, but I can't help but be interested in this too, and this revolves around the use of the term in business settings. So you may have heard different businesses, especially when organisations do bad things, or there's a scandal or something, and the commentary is often that there was a culture of something or other. And so culture within business has become quite a big, important area of attention. It's something that as an organisational psychologist I talk about quite a lot with the businesses that I work with. And in this setting I tend to describe an organisational culture as the accepted norms, or it's the way things are done around here. So as an example, I'll talk about a type of culture which might be a safety culture, for instance. And this says something about the prevailing attitudes and behaviours around safety. Now, I've seen all different types of cultures around this question. For instance, in the past I've worked with people in oil and gas on oil rigs in the middle of the North Sea. So in these environments they tend to have a very strong safety conscious culture. For instance, stopping someone, even a very senior person, and intervening upon them as they do something that isn't really allowed as some sort of safety infringement, such as walking in a high-vis vest area without one, becomes completely normal. So it's completely normal for me to go up to the boss of the whole rig and say, look, I noticed you were doing this thing. You need to make sure you wear a high-vis vest, or you need to make sure you're walking on these special walkways. That's just accepted. Whereas when I've worked in factories, the idea that a junior person might go up to the general manager and intervene on them just would be greeted with scepticism. That just wouldn't be done. You just wouldn't go up to a senior person and intervene in that way. So there's a difference in the culture there. So it's like, what's normal practice? So in a way that kind of defines what we mean by the word culture. However, I remember one of the first sessions when I was doing my masters was about concepts that have no real scientific validity, and they actually used the idea of workplace culture as one of these, which was kind of a bit disturbing because obviously I was talking about it. So the idea of a culture is itself contested. Is there actually such a thing? Especially in highly individualized societies, can we really talk about prevailing attitudes and behaviours, or do people just do their own thing? And at what level should we be looking at this? Should we talk about national cultures, or is that too high a level? Squeezing the nation into the idea of just one culture perhaps is not really a good way of looking at it. Should we talk about cultures in terms of racial or ethnic background? All of these are tricky, difficult areas to talk about. So this is just a short podcast. I can't talk about all of these areas right now, but I'm going to do my best to try and understand it within the sort of parameters that I've laid here. So all the questions that I've just raised reflect the incredibly messy picture when we start to look at culture. My view is that although it's messy, to decide that it's too complicated, therefore we'll just ignore it, has to be a mistake, even in the workplace. People, that's us, we are conscious of differences in behaviour, differences in traditions, beliefs, attitudes, etc. And as human beings, we create categories. It's part of our psychology. So we're going to put people into certain cultures, and we do it to ourselves too. So to pretend culture doesn't exist and that it's not important really denies our experience as human beings. But of course we have to be careful when we talk about it to remember that cultures do not create neatly distinct groups, but they're actually a loose constellation of practices that overlap with others. So it's not a nice, easy box that you can put people into. When we talk about culture, we really mean obvious things like religious affiliation and the practices and customs that go along with them. We also talk about the taken for granted bits of behaviour, such as, let's say, hospitality to strangers, handshaking when greeting people we know, the cuisine, the times of day main meals are eaten, the tendencies to form orderly queues. I'm thinking of the UK in particular here. Norms around marriage and sexual behaviour and liberal attitudes towards guns, for instance. And I'm thinking of the US there. These are just some of the areas that when we experience a difference, we notice it. The experience can just be that we notice it and are inquisitive, or that we're disturbed or irritated by it. And how we respond is partly situational. Does it affect us negatively in that situation? Or it can also be down to our personal sensitivity to difference. So while we might talk about the culture as a generalisation, individuals don't necessarily conform to this. For instance, in cultures where it's traditional and normal to accept strangers into your home, not everyone will do this. Not every Brit is willing to take their place in the queue. Yeah, we have queue hoppers too. So we also have to be aware of these exceptions too. When people worry about the destruction or at least dilution of their culture, they tend to think about it as if the culture is a fixed monoculture, where everyone currently part of the community follows the cultural norms and only these others, these outsiders, act differently. But of course that's not the case. So an example of this is one of the anxieties I sometimes hear in the UK is people asserting that this is a Christian country. Obviously, this is in response to noticing people who are not Christian observing different customs. But the reality is that this country, the UK, has many different faiths and lots of people like me with none. I accept that Protestantism has been the dominant church for hundreds of years and that the head of state is also the head of the Church of England, but culturally the UK is not a particularly religious place. Some people go to church and observe certain customs, but by far the majority only attend church at the so-called hatches, matches and dispatches. 22 million people, that's about a third of the UK population, stated on the latest survey that they had no religion. So by far the biggest threat to Christianity is not Islam, it's the nuns. By nuns I mean none, none. When it says religion on your survey, none is one of the options. So it's those of us that practice no religion, some of whom identify as atheist or agnostic, but the majority are just people who see no real role for religion in their lives. But that isn't the anxiety of some people who feel the need to defend the Christian culture. The anxiety seems to be exclusively about Muslims, who actually number in the UK about 3.9 million out of a population of about 68 million. Earlier, I mentioned this term multiculturalism. It's worth just circling back to this. When I first came across the term, I didn't really understand its full meaning. It just sounded like it was describing having different cultures, but it's a bit more than that. It's the idea that it's possible to accept and even embrace different cultures living side by side. So in this model, the host society does not insist upon the migrant community, for instance, adopting the host's cultural norms. Instead, within certain parameters, and these are important, which I'll come back to later, difference is tolerated and even at times celebrated. Now, I keep hearing about the so-called failed experiment in multiculturalism. But given that culture is such a powerful thing, it would be amazing if there were no points of difficulty, no matter how you manage it. We've spoken before on this podcast about Henri Tajfel's experiments with in and out groups, and the tendency for humans to favour the in-group, even when it comes to minimal differences. Now, an obvious signal for in and out groups is obviously cultural practices, so it's no surprise that there will be moments when these deep psychological tendencies to be distrustful or even just sticking to your social norms is the way that things happen, because it's part of the psychology. But to be honest, I'm often impressed and heartened by the countless successful interactions between cultures. Speaking for myself, I feel like I've benefited enormously from my exposure to multiple cultural practices. I think about my friends, the food I enjoy, the sports stars I cheer and who win medals for the country, the artists, the filmmakers and actors whose parents and grandparents made the UK their home. I like living in a country where I can experience different cultural practices, and if I want, to take part in them. I remember joining a bunch of Italian friends to a local cinema back in 2006 to watch their team win the World Cup. I was kind of a adopted Italian that night. I like going to my friend's house to eat traditional Middle Eastern food. I love my friends with family who emigrated from the Caribbean, and I have to say, as a young Jehovah's Witness full-time minister, my days talking to Muslims and Hindus, and I've got to mention the particularly wonderful Avatar, a Sikh, were amongst the most enjoyable as they sat me down and served me milky tea while we spoke of cosmic questions. It was much better than getting the door slammed in my face. These days I'm proud to train and work with wonderful Polish, Latvian, Lithuanian, Portuguese people who work in our food production facilities. I'm often impressed by their attitude, their talent, their work ethic. Anyway, the point is, while there are bound to be instances where cultures clash, it's not the majority of my experience, and I think most people's. Again, it's a bit like that initial experiment I learned as a child. You notice the differences. You notice the times when it perhaps doesn't work, but don't notice all the times when it does. Okay, just a quick break here to update you about the podcast. As you know, Celine and I took a break earlier this year, and it's been a bit longer than we expected, but we are making plans to launch a new podcast shortly, so we'll talk about that very, very soon. Thank you for your patience. In the meantime, I will be continuing with the Cult Hackers content on a solo basis. So if you've got any topics you'd like me to think out loud about, please drop me a message. Currently I'm not doing interviews, but I would like to start reading out emails. Now, I'm always careful not to read out messages unless you say I can, so we do get sent messages. Sometimes the emails are quite long. Really lovely to read them, and I find them very, very interesting, but I never mention them on the show, and that's because I'm always very conscious that many of our listeners need to maintain strict anonymity. So if you would like to contribute to the conversation so that I can read these ideas out or these thoughts, please let me know on the message that you're happy for me to read it out. You can tell me on there as well whether you want me to use the name, or just make up a name, or you tell me what name you want to use. But I'm extra careful because I know some of you are just not able to reveal who you are. And finally, before we go back to the main podcast, I wanted to tell you about a former guest, Denise Wise, who reached out to me to tell me about her latest single. So Denise was on the episode that we did about Witness Underground. So she's a British singer-songwriter. She's also written a book. So I'll put a link onto her LinkTree page on the show notes. She's released a new single and she's got a book called Rising from the Ashes of Jehovah's Witnesses. So check her out and support Denise if you can. Right, now back to the podcast. Now, I mentioned earlier about the limits of tolerance for cultural practices, and I think that we have to talk about that too. Of course, we need to treat people with respect and dignity, regardless of their beliefs, but that doesn't mean that as a society we can accept cultural practices that are harmful. After all, this is at the heart of the discussion around cults. Now, the word cult clearly tells us that we're talking about cultural practices. But in these cases, these cultural practices harm those who are part of it. So obviously, slavery, child marriage, coercive control cannot be tolerated. Methods of high control over people, such as forcing them to work long hours for nothing or next to nothing, forcing people to give up their liberty, hand over their life savings under false pretenses, threatening that they will lose their family and friends and whole community if they do not obediently do what they're told. The answer that this is simply our culture, and you've got to put up with it, is not acceptable. These harmful practices must stop, and we need legislation to ensure that these organisations, regardless of their size, are not allowed to do these things. So another potential wrinkle, I suppose, here is that as a humanist, I'm also against religious schools, regardless of the denomination. So while I'm relaxed about children being taught the religion of their birth, of course, I think schools should be a place where children learn about different faiths and beliefs as part of a rounded education, but also receive high quality education about evidence-based scientific facts about such things as evolution, the geography and geology of the planet, chemistry, biology, etc., as well as the culturally diverse and wonderful world of the arts. It's important for them individually, but also for society as a whole. So long as the religious and cultural practices don't infringe upon other human rights, I support the right to worship and practice a religious belief. This does not mean I have to agree with it, and honest, good faith debate and discussion about belief is something that should be encouraged by all communities. Also, a lack of this ability to think about things from other people's perspectives and other ways of thinking, and the limitations of individual parents, is why I'm very worried about large numbers of parents taking their children out of school and doing homeschooling. We did talk about this on a special episode going back a couple of years now, so you'll be able to find that in our back catalogue. Alright, so I talked about the idea of culture needing defending. So does it need defending? Does a culture need to be defended? I don't think so. In a way, I think the idea is a bit daft. It's true that people make and shape culture. It's also true that cultural practices at times compete for dominance within a larger culture. But this happens through practice and influence, not through the forceful suppression of one culture over another. Culture grows and adopts other cultures, morphs, twists and turns. For instance, today in the UK we think of going out for a curry as, about as British as it gets. Of course, Indian food originates from a different culture, but British Indian food is a bit different to Indian food in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh. The same goes for Chinese or Greek or Turkish or Persian. So as it morphs, as it grows, as it develops, as tastes change, it becomes something else. Something with a heritage, but it's also shared. It's something special. And I like that. Around the world, particularly in developed countries like the UK, USA, Australia, France, Italy, Canada, etc., there is a lot of talk about the problems of migration. And it's true that there are some problems. For instance, each year in the UK, thousands of people risk their lives on unsuitable small boats to make the journey across the Channel. Unfortunately, some of them die on the journey, including children. We have to find a way to end this practice. It's so dangerous, and the disorderly way it happens makes it impossible to manage properly. But this phenomena is not an attack on the culture. It's either desperate people fleeing tyranny or just normal people looking for a better life, whichever you choose to believe. It's most likely a bit of both, but either way, what it is not is some sort of movement to take over a culture. We mentioned the psychology behind in-groups and out-groups already, and another psychological tendency is for people to find others with similar cultural practices and to some degree group together. This is one of the reasons why British retirees who decided to spend their retirement in Spain formed communities, including golf clubs, pubs and fish and chip shops. That people having come from different countries may want to come together to live, work and play is not surprising. But there may also be other reasons beyond the control of the migrants themselves. Often poorer people who have migrated will find themselves living close to others like them, having more to do with financial realities and just being able to find a house where they can than any choice on their part. This reality can produce specific areas where the majority population have different cultural practices to the wider host community. And there can be stresses here. It's a situation that can produce an effect where communities become isolated, leading to citizens of a country leading what was described by academic Professor Ted Cantle, looking into issues around community cohesion, as parallel lives. I had the pleasure of working with Ted Cantle on a development of his work on community cohesion called Workforce Cohesion, where we were working with food businesses who employed large numbers of migrant workers, helping to create environments where different cultures could coalesce around common values through sharing and mutual appreciation. The philosophy that best describes this approach is the concluding paragraph of Professor Cantle's report. I'll put a link on the show notes here. The very last paragraph, he says, "The opposite of parallel lives is not assimilation, as some commentators seem to fear. In fact, some form of clustering on the basis of distinct communities will help to maintain cultural heritage. Interaction is about shared experiences, building trust and understanding differences, not about being the same. Having some values in common does not mean sharing all values, but some level of commonality is necessary for a shared society and generating solidarity. And commonalities can exist only if society is indeed shared." And I think that's a realistic and pragmatic way of thinking about it. It's not either assimilation entirely or you have these parallel lives. No, it's about understanding that there's differences, that people will form communities and groups, but that there's a time for sharing and also coalescing around specific things that everyone can get behind. When cultural practices rub up against each other, there is likely to be some moments of difficulty, even at times tension. It's important to note, though, that we see tension as much within cultures, especially across generations, as we do between them. Younger people may have different cultural norms to their parents. This may be towards the host culture, or may go the other way, as young people seek an identity and find hostility towards them and those like them. It is inevitable that there will be issues where people from different background and cultural norms live closely, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible to manage. As Ted Cantle puts it, the answer is not to try and suppress cultural practices, of course with the caveats that I've already mentioned, but instead to share and increase levels of familiarity and comfort between these different cultural practices. So this brings me back to something I promised I'd return to. My upbringing as a Jehovah's Witness meant that I believed I was someone who was all in on cultural equality and tolerance. After all, we had brothers and sisters from all around the world, as we called our fellow Jehovah's Witnesses. The pictures of paradise always included racial diversity, all happily living together in perfection. The problem is that the organisation is actually not interested in celebrating cultural diversity so much as creating a monoculture amongst people of all races. The command to be no part of the world, as it's practiced by Jehovah's Witnesses, means treating collective cultural practices with suspicion at best and hostility at worst. Religious traditions, regardless of whether people buy into the religious beliefs, are at the forefront of many cultural practices. Christmas, Easter, Hanukkah, Eid, Diwali, and so on are something Jehovah's Witnesses cannot get involved with. And this has the effect of isolating individuals from their cultural heritage. It also gets in the way of enjoying a nice simple part of someone else's culture. I'll take a simple example. In a place I used to work, we had a couple of people with Indian heritage who were from a Hindu tradition. Now, I've got no idea how devout they were. They never tried to convert me or change me into a Hindu, but they identified as Hindus, to use a phrase. I know very little about the celebration of Diwali, but what I do know is that it's part of the tradition to give family and friends little boxes with delicious sweet treats inside. Now, the two people in the department who celebrated this got together and at their own cost bought everyone in the department, that's about 60 people, these little boxes with treats inside. They did it every year. Now, by then I'd left the organisation, but if I'd still remained a witness, I think I would have felt the need to politely hand the box back and explain that as one of Jehovah's Witnesses I cannot accept their gift because of my religious beliefs. Now, maybe not every witness would do that. I'm sure many, out of a sense of embarrassment, would just quietly take it and say nothing, but I was one of those people who tried to be obedient in all things. The point is, though, that this little act of cross-cultural interaction is a harmless, and in my view, wholly positive thing. But it's stifled, in this case because of the obsession with not doing anything related to what is believed to be false worship. Actually, the pictures of the paradise are not a celebration of different cultures, but of the imposition of a worldwide monoculture. The modern day organisation of Jehovah's Witnesses does not celebrate different cultures, but imposes its version of Christianity onto everyone, regardless of their heritage. So if you live in Japan and have a Shinto upbringing, your cultural practices are rubbished as ancestor worship. If you are African, you have to abandon your previous beliefs. If you are raised as a Muslim, you must leave your faith and tell people that you are no longer a Muslim and stop celebrating their practices. I remember listening to experiences on the platform about how difficult it could be to tell family and friends that they would no longer be sharing in these cultural practices. Sometimes these individuals would face being cut off and shunned by their families. Yes, you heard it, actual criticism of other cultures for their intolerance of a person's choice to change their religion. The hypocrisy is hard to believe given the practice of mandated shunning for leaving the faith and becoming part of a new one. So a few cultural differences remain. Food, of course, is diverse so long as the cultural practices around meat and bleeding the animal are followed. But because so many cultural celebrations, especially group ones, are based originally upon religious observances, they're not allowed, and members of the congregation continually practicing them will face a committee of elders where removal from the congregation will be very much on the cards, with its accompanying shunning practices. So no, as a child, I was not really welcoming of other cultures. I expected people to change their own cultural practices and beliefs in order to share in mine. Now, as a humanist and a secularist, I can appreciate culture of all sorts. It doesn't mean I have to accept the beliefs, and it also doesn't mean I can never criticise religious beliefs. For instance, I can visit a cathedral and be in awe at the amazing architecture without having to believe in the religious doctrines. I can also recognise the abuses of power the leaders of the Christian church engaged in over the couple of millennia they've been going. Okay, that sort of brings me to the end of this episode of the podcast about culture. Now, you might be wondering why I haven't mentioned the so-called culture wars that are raging across social media. I've not done so because I think culture war is actually a misnomer. I don't think they're really wars about culture, not in the sense that I've been talking about it today. I think these are slightly different, albeit connected. If I'm brave enough, I might talk about this in relation to what I see as tribalism. But for today, that's it. Thanks for listening. Speak to you soon. Bye for now.